have to say that I love the United States fervently. I love Western values, or as Daniel Hannan, a British Conservative MEP, put it less politely in his book How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters, the characteristic features of the Anglo-American political system, which of course have been adopted more widely, especially after 1945 and again after 1989. With Western or Anglo-American values, I include such features as habeas corpus, equality before the law, and jury trials, which will be particularly pertinent to what I have to say today. These are features that found their purest and most beautiful literary and legal expression in the US Constitution. Please excuse my Britsplaining, but the Constitution is not a document that resulted from abstract theoretical ruminations on what a good society would look like. The Constitution was the heroic response of the founders of the US to escaping from a tyrannical state. They enshrined due process and fair treatment under the law in Amendments 5 to 8 and 14 of the Bill of Rights because they knew what life was like without those things, both from their collective memory of capricious governance in Britain and as British subjects in America. Their rejection of arbitrary detention and cruel and unusual punishments and their insistence on due process were truly progressive. My call today is to honour them and embrace their progressive spirit in our approaches to criminal justice both in the UK and the US. This is a men's issue, with men accounting for 90 to 95% of the prison population, and I have faith in the men's human rights movement as a progressive movement in the most beautiful possible way to heed what I have to say. At this point, you may be wondering why I've referred to chivalry in my talk title. I have 3 reasons. Firstly, it is clickbait. Secondly, I have a penchant for going back as far as I can in history for its own sake. And thirdly, it has some tenuous relevance. The commonly accepted era of chivalry encompassed several centuries and an entire continent. There was never a single chivalric code that all knights abided by, but rather countless rules and injunctions laid out in separate codes by authorities ranging from dukes to bishops and even poets. Chivalry is commonly seen as going through 3 ages. Chivalry 1.0, from the late 10th century, centered around warrior ethics, fair fighting, and loyalty to comrades and lords. Knights were instructed not to be devious or underhanded in combat, and to aim to take opponents hostage rather than to take life. They were not to refuse a challenge from an equal, but also not to fight for pecuniary reward. Faith and piety were central tenets of chivalry throughout the deeply Christianized medieval Europe of the Middle Ages, and furthermore, many chivalric codes, particularly those established by bishops, funnily enough, included particular directions to treat the men and property of the church with respect. Chivalry 2.0. From the middle 11th century, knighthood went from being a preserve of low-class men to being associated with a landed social elite as well as a martial one, so chivalric codes came to include instructions to be just and fair in relation to common citizenry. Bishop Warrenus of Beauvoir, for example, wanted knights to swear against mistreating male and female villagers, merchants, and pilgrims. He also forbade plundering and stealing from the poor, even at the perfidious instigation of a local lord. Bishop Warrenus did specify in his oath that knights should not attack noble women travelling alone or nuns and widows, unless he should find them committing misdeeds against him. Knights, though, were to protect the weak and defenceless and to fight for the welfare of all, as according to the Song of Roland. The Duke of Burgundy listed 12 indispensable knightly virtues as follows: faith, charity, justice, sagacity, prudence, temperance, resolution, truth, liberality, diligence, hope, and valour. Chivalry 3.0. In the late Middle Ages, Queen Consort of France and England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, spearheaded a movement within her court to subvert the chivalric code to regulate the behaviour of men towards women. These women initiated a system of romantic feudalism which saw first noblemen and later men in general, as a class, subject to irresistible pressure to defer to women and to subjugate themselves to women's needs and wants on a hitherto unprecedented level. I'd like to add two more ages. Chivalry 4.0, the modern chivalry that has developed since the Middle Ages, is entirely focused on gender relations. What makes it different now to Chivalry 3.0 is that 3.0, for all of its absurdity and the injustices perpetrated in its name, was instigated in a period of time wherein men and women each had privileges in different spheres. It was designed to capitalise on women's natural dominance in the private sphere. Now we've developed into societies wherein not only do women have equal rights, but they are actually privileged in the public as well as the private sphere. This makes chivalry now far more malevolent and immoral. Chivalry 5.0, I've just invented. It's based on ideas from Chivalry 2.0, with the central principles concerning authorities treating citizens with justice, dignity, and compassion. I'd like to take this moment to thank you for all of your patience with my tangent there. Now, we all want to make our communities safer and reduce offending, right? The evidence is clear. For minor offences, community sentencing, fines and other alternatives, including early intervention and supervision, are often significantly more effective at reducing offending and re-offending than imprisonment. There is, unfortunately, no simple cookie-cutter answer to the question of precisely what intervention will work with any given demographic to prevent crime or further crime, but individuals who are treated with holistic approaches to reform their behaviour tend to show markedly improved outcomes to those who receive purely punitive sentences when they're convicted. Where prison is necessary to protect the public in the immediate future and for the term of the prison sentence, as well as potentially deterring the offender and others from committing such crimes, although the deterrent effect is highly questionable, we must keep in mind the fact that nearly every prisoner will be released at some point. It's irrelevant how justified a certain punishment may be. We need to concentrate on policies that make our communities safer and reduce reoffending. In the words of Steven Pinker, criminal punishment is not a mandate to implement cosmic justice, but part of an incentive structure that discourages antisocial acts without causing more suffering than it deters. The reason the punishment should fit the crime, for example, is not to balance some mystical scale of justice, but to ensure that a wrongdoer stops at a minor crime rather than escalating to more harmful ones. Cruel punishments, whether or not they are in some sense deserved, are no more effective at deterring harm than moderate but surer punishments, and they desensitize spectators and brutalize the society that implements them. It's easy to feel animosity towards offenders who break the social rules that make our societies work and hurt their victims in various ways, but actually, when their histories and circumstances are considered, I find it pretty difficult not to feel compassion towards them too. According to the Prison Reform Trust's 2017 Bromley Briefings Prison Fact File, in the UK, 24% of offenders were taken into care as a child, compared with 2% of the general population. They were 9 percentage points more likely to have experienced child abuse and 27 percentage points more likely to have seen violence in their family homes. 59% regularly played truant from school as compared to 5%, and 42% were expelled or excluded from school as compared to less than 1% of the general population. 47% had no qualifications as compared to 15% of the general population. 68% were unemployed compared to 8%, with 13% never having had a job compared to 4%. 15% were homeless compared to 4%. They were far more likely to have suffered from all manner of mental illnesses, including addiction, and to have attempted suicide. The Prison Reform Trust document did not include statistics for fatherlessness, but government documents reveal that less than 50% of prisoners were raised in two-parent households, compared to the national average of 85%. According to a 2012 Psychology Today piece, the figures for youths in American prisons could be as many as 85% fatherless. Not only do these characteristics appeal to us to treat offenders humanely, though, they suggest a definite potential for improving their lives and their behaviour. These people, as a rule, aren't simply bad. They're challenged by difficult issues and circumstances, and that actually offers us opportunities to help them. Nearly every prisoner will be released, so what do? Treat them harshly, ignore the root causes of their behaviour and hope we can intimidate them into scathing compliance with the law? Or treat them with dignity and humanity, attending to their needs and helping them to feel invested in societies that they may feel have neglected them in the past? One of these approaches appeals to our bloodlust for punishing those who commit crimes, and it can be taken as a given that it's utilised disproportionately against men who we judge so much less generously than women. The other approach is a rational response that demonstrably prevents crime and also happens to be cheaper, if decidedly more complicated. No one method exists to prevent criminality, but there are many options that can contribute to effectively reforming individuals or even inhibit the urge to criminal behaviours before they start. Upbringing is key, and it's of paramount importance that our societies take their responsibilities as laid out in Article 16.3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which both the UK and the US are signed up to, which states that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. The Centre for Social Justice, which is nothing like what it sounds like, recommends that marriage should again be recognised in the UK tax system, with specific allowance for low and middle income married couples. Their research showed that 78% of British adults agreed with this policy, and that a new cabinet-level ministerial brief family policy, supported by an Office for Family Policy with a budget and civil service team, should be created. According to their research, 89% of adults say they would support public money being spent to strengthen families and for improving parenting, specifically for children growing up in poverty. 64% of the public regard fatherlessness as a serious problem for society, according to the same research. The prisoner characteristic statistics indicate that they're right to think so. So, we should be ensuring that fathers have equal rights to mothers in legislation and in practice, and that their children have the meaningful relationships with both their parents that they deserve wherever possible. Offenders themselves benefit enormously from maintaining familial contact, and the 2017 review by Lord Farmer, The Importance of Strengthening Family Ties, specifically regarding men in prison, found that family support is critical for both well-being and reintegration. Meaningful contact can reduce reoffending by 39%, but in our overcrowded prison system, prisoners are often shipped to the far ends of the country to fill free spaces, and family members can find it difficult, therefore, to make the so important visits. Skilled supervision, which can be used as an alternative to imprisonment or post-release, has been shown to reduce reoffending by up to 17 percentage points. Core correctional practices include offender managers consistently and clearly modelling behaviours and attitudes that are anti-criminal, reinforcing desired behaviour and disapproval of undesirable behaviour, using natural opportunities to enhance problem solving, cognitive restructuring, which is helping people consider alternatives to their attitudes and beliefs, developing a warm, empathic and non-judgmental relationship, and motivational interviewing. Problems with addiction and mental health issues are, of course, a priority for many offenders, and it's generally wise to complete treatment courses in these areas before embarking on behavioural reform strategies. Support from the Prisoners Education Trust for educational courses or learning materials reduce reoffending by a quarter, and employment can be of enormous benefit, particularly when it's stable, meaningful, and provides a sense of mastery. Day release for occupational apprenticeships can be life-changing, especially when coupled with careers opportunities when a prisoner is freed. The UK has the highest rate of imprisonment in Western Europe, despite the National Audit Office conclusion that there is no link between prison population and crime rates. International comparisons also show no consistent link between the two. The majority of prisoners have committed a non-violent offence, and nearly half were sentenced to less than 6 months inside, despite the Ministry of Justice conclusion that short sentences are less effective at reducing reoffending than community sentences. The use of community sentences has more than halved over the last decade. The cost of imprisoning an individual for a year in the UK is £35,000 versus £4,000 for a community service sentence. UK prisons are incredibly overcrowded, and they are less safe than when records began, with higher rates of self-harm, assaults on inmates and staff, and deaths than ever before documented. Nearly half of all adults are reconvicted of another offence within a year of leaving prison. This was understood by our previous Justice Secretary David Gauke and Conservative mayoral candidate Sean Bailey, who wrote about the problems with the punitive approach to minor offences in particular in The Times, under the headline, "Prison is a dead end for many offenders and we need to avoid it." In the article published this year, the pair claim that when it comes to the length of prison sentences, we're taking a more punitive approach than at any point during Margaret Thatcher's premiership, and describe young, naive, petty criminals entering prison with a GCSE and leaving with a PhD in criminality. They call not for hard or soft, but smart justice. Their suggestion is that we do use more community sentences rather than prison, but that we toughen them up by ensuring enforcement and ease public anxiety by tagging offenders so they can be tracked. David Gauke, however, spent most of his tenure seemingly creating a legacy not based on fair and effective policy, but on pandering to feminist zealots for whom women representing a whole 5% of our prison population is the greatest issue our criminal justice system faces. Under his secretaryship, a landmark decision was taken to abandon plans to build new women's prisons and instead create community hubs with residential capacity and treatments and support available to help women change their lives. I'm going to level with you. I'm conflicted on this policy. I think and I hope it will work for sure, but I veer between utterly outraged that the demographic chosen to benefit from this approach is the demographic already most privileged in the criminal justice system, and resigned to the pragmatic idea that if we keep our fingers crossed, a successful trial with this policy with women may persuade the state to roll out the same to men. Boris Johnson's recent pledge of £2.5 billion for 10,000 new prison beds, and the rumour that he will scrap David Gauke's plan to abolish sentences of 6 months or less for all but the most serious criminals, puts this hope into question. Our new Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, is a different kettle of fish. Appointed on the 24th of July 2019, he immediately backed a claim by Sir Cliff Richard and Paul Gambaccini to ban the naming of those arrested on suspicion of rape and other sexual offences. Downing Street promptly made it clear that his comments did not represent government policy, but I feel encouraged by his attitude, as it looks like it could just be more pro-men than I've come to expect. But his comment that more and better prison places means less reoffending and a lower burden on the taxpayer does suggest that he may not be the reformer that we need. Researchers found a significant increase in the likelihood that offenders will be sentenced to custodial sentences if they're from an ethnic minority rather than white. This is dwarfed, though, by the increased likelihood that offenders will be sentenced to a custodial sentence if they're men rather than women. Feminist campaigning has seen to it that female convicts are treated with compassion and that rehabilitation and preventing reoffending take precedence as a general rule over punishment. But the same humane and rational approach is still dragging behind, over 100 years since the Enlightenment that Steven Pinker wrote about, when it comes to the treatment of male convicts. According to William Collins, if men were treated as leniently in the criminal justice system as women are today, 5 out of 6 men in UK prisons would be free. Factors that explain this disparity, according to the Ministry of Justice, include a greater percentage of convicted men being sentenced to prison, men being given longer sentences on average than women, women being paroled earlier than men, despite being more likely to be disciplined for bad behaviour whilst incarcerated, and women being more likely to have mitigating factors such as age, dependence, lack of previous relevant convictions, and the appearance of genuine remorse applied to their sentences, whereas men are more likely to have aggravating factors such as presence of previous relevant convictions, the location of the offence being a member of a group or gang, or evidence of some degree of pre-planning or premeditation applied to their sentences. Women are somewhat less likely to re-offend after being convicted as a crime, 18% as opposed to 26% of men. But I firmly believe that the treatment that they receive in the criminal justice system, as well as the more sympathetic attitude taken to them by society in general, as displayed in media coverage of crimes, are critical factors in explaining this disparity. The gender justice gap in the US, according to Professor Sonia Starr in 2012, is 6 times as great as the racial justice gap, with women siphoned out of the criminal justice system at every stage, ultimately ending up, if they do end up in prison, with 63% shorter sentences. Women account for 10% of prisoners in the US. In 2015, Hillary Rodham Clinton said in a speech that it's a stark fact that the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, yet we have almost 25% of the world's total prison population. The numbers today are much higher than they were 30 or 40 years ago, despite the fact that crime is at historic lows. 2018 statistics showed that the US prison rate per 100,000 people still dwarfs other nations, with Turkey in second place, locking up 287 people per 100,000, compared to the US's 655 per 100,000. However, the most pro-male POTUS that I never thought I'd see signed a bipartisan bill called the First Step Act last December. The bill reduced mandatory minimum sentences for some non-violent offences, especially drug offences, as well as giving judges more discretion and encouraging rehabilitation efforts, and ended the Clinton-era 3 strikes rule under which anyone convicted of 3 serious offences was jailed for life. On June the 13th, President Trump announced that the White House is advancing second chance hiring to help returning citizens transition back to society successfully by supporting their right to employment. The black demographic, which has been disproportionately affected by incarceration, with black adults being 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as whites, will gain tremendously from this administration's commitment to fixing broken areas in the US justice system and expanding opportunity. Following the passage of the First Step Act, blacks comprised over 90% of prisoners whose sentences were reduced because of resentencing provisions. The unemployment rate for former prisoners was nearly 5 times higher at 27% than the national average when the bill was signed. The Trump administration aims to cut the unemployment rate for returning citizens to single digits within 5 years. There's an all-hands-on-deck effort across federal agencies, the private sector, states and criminal justice reform organizations to help former inmates find opportunities and succeed in their jobs. For example, the Department of Justice and Bureau of Prisons are launching an initiative to connect returning citizens with employers looking to hire them. The Department of Labor will give states $2 million for bonds that underwrite companies which hire workers with criminal backgrounds. Even federal jobs will no longer effectively be off limits, as the Office of Personnel Management will make job listings on USA Jobs available to those in and released from prison. Another obstacle to working for former inmates is securing a license to practice a vocation or trade in their home state. Thankfully, occupational licensing reform efforts across many states is underway to reduce or eliminate onerous and costly requirements or scale back prohibitions for those with criminal backgrounds. Globally, the war on drugs costs more than $100 billion per annum in law enforcement, with 1 in 5 prisoners incarcerated for drug offences, 85% for possession only. In 2017, the US sent over 450,000 people to prison for drug offences, and today there are more people behind bars for a drug offence than the number of people who were inside for any crime in 1980. This has resulted in 25% of incarcerated women and 14% of incarcerated men serving time for a drug offence. Given that the US prison system is operating above capacity, US prisons could well do with a population reduction which would allow for safer and more effective management and treatment of other prisoners. Moreover, evidence from Portugal, where all drug use was decriminalised in 2001, amidst an epidemic of drug-related problems like addiction, crime and deaths, has shown that liberalising drug laws and taking a health-based approach can lead to seriously positive outcomes, including huge reductions in HIV and hepatitis infections and deaths. There is no solid evidence that the criminalisation of drugs decreases their use. In fact, a recent paper by Mark Anderson et al. From Montana State University found a near 10% decrease in marijuana use amongst teens in states that have legalized the drug. Not only this, but prohibition pushes the market towards riskier, more potent products that are both more profitable and easier to smuggle as they require less space, and it pushes consumption into unsafe environments and robs consumers of the opportunity to make properly informed decisions about what they use. It's prohibition that has led to the trend for marijuana containing increased levels of the chemical THC, which makes people stoned but also vulnerable to psychosis, and decreased levels of CBD, which inhibits the negative actions of THC. So, if you're worried about marijuana causing antisocial behaviour and crime, legalization is the way forward. Capital punishment is currently legal in 29 US states. The practice brutalizes the wonderful country and needs to die its own death. I'm only human. When I hear about some crimes, of course I feel an instinct for eye justice. But what I'm asking for today is an evidence-based approach to criminal justice, and the death penalty fails that test. Firstly, miscarriages of justice do happen. From 2005 to 2011, there were on average 5 people released from death row per year after their innocence had been proven. Secondly, it's wildly expensive. For example, enforcing the death penalty costs Florida $51 million a year above what it would cost to punish all first-degree murderers with life in prison without parole, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. Thirdly, it does not work as a deterrent. A 2012 report by the National Research Council titled Deterrence and the Death Penalty stated that studies claiming that the death penalty has a deterrent effect on murder rates are fundamentally flawed and should not be used when making policy decisions, and consistent with previous years, the 2016 FBI Uniform Crime Report showed that the South had the highest murder rate while accounting for over 80% of executions, while the Northeast, which has less than 1% of all executions, has the lowest murder rate. Our criminal justice systems, both in the UK and the US, leave a lot to be desired, but the US certainly is moving slowly in the right direction. I'm not so positive about the UK right now. There is an appetite for change both from the public and certainly from the Trump administration that could help individuals and communities greatly. Now is the time to exert pressure to ensure that innovation flourishes and that progressive policies reach everyone who can benefit from them and transform their lives. A UK study found that 97% of prisoners report that they want to stop offending. Let's help them.